Greetings, everyone. My name is Wayne Jennings, and I want to personally welcome you to our forum discussion today. Our speakers will be discussing reproductive freedom, Supreme Court or states' rights. Our Shaker Heights Unitarian congregation organizes these forums for several reasons: as a congregational service to the community, to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all of us. We appreciate your joining us today. I'd now like to introduce the coordinator for today's forum, Ken Freeze. He'll introduce the topic and our speakers. Ken?
Okay, thank you, Wayne. As a quick overview, since 1974 Roe v. Wade decision, the U.S. abortion landscape has grown increasingly restrictive. Between 2011 and 2019, states enacted 483 abortion restrictions. In 2017, Ohio had 14 facilities providing abortion services, and now there are 9. Given the current U.S. Supreme Court with a membership of 6 conservative judges, if you will, and 3 who are liberal. I hate using terms like that for a judge, but that's the way it is. The question is, what will happen to women's reproductive health rights? What will happen to the right to have an abortion? And what funding will occur for organizations providing health care and abortions? How will this be affected in the future? For today, our speakers are Jessie Hill, Juris Doctor, Case Western Reserve Professor of Law, Associate Dean for Research and Facility Development. Prior to joining Case, amongst many things, Professor Hill worked at Reproductive Freedom Project of the National ACLU office in New York and litigated challenge to state law restrictions on reproductive rights. Catrina, Otonoga, Juris Doctor, is Preterm Clinic Manager for Policy and Partnership. She is an advocate of healthcare with a strong focus on abortion and reproductive health. Now, I ask you to welcome our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, should I go ahead?
Hi, Jessie. I think we can just kick it off, right?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for having me here today. I really appreciate for the kind introduction, Wayne and Ken. I want to start, so you have 2 speakers today. I wanted to start by kind of giving the broad legal overview and landscape of abortion in the country and in Ohio right now. Put a little more detail into that description of what's been going on in the past, particularly about 10 years or so. And then I guess Catrina is going to talk a little more about the sort of impact on the clinics and the patients and some the effects that some specific laws have had and so on. So just to give, again, starting from the basics, I don't know if folks are all familiar with the cases and the sort of what has happened since Roe v. Wade has been decided, but right, so the Roe v. Wade decision in the 1970s was when the Supreme Court said that there is a constitutional right of a person to choose to become a parent or not to become a parent, and that right includes the right to choose abortion. And therefore, that states could not ban abortion altogether, that they could maybe impose some restrictions on abortion, but the court put out there a fairly protective framework for abortion rights, because the court said this is a fundamental right to choose whether to have an abortion or not. That was a 7-2 decision. Actually, a lot of people don't tend to mention that in connection with Roe v. Wade. So there were Republican appointees, Democratic appointees. This is something, going back to the point about the conservative majority on the Supreme Court. It was not a partisan decision when Roe v. Wade was decided. But almost immediately after Roe, there was a sort of a real movement toward trying to restrict abortion rights and real mobilization on the anti-abortion side around this. So attempts to overturn it, to get a constitutional amendment passed, other attempts to circumvent Roe v. Wade, states passing laws intended to circumvent Roe v. Wade. And usually the Supreme Court was pretty protective, again, of that abortion right and continued to strike down those state laws that impinged on abortion rights. However, there was kind of at the same time this longer term strategy in place, right, to overturn Roe and to build a more conservative Supreme Court and federal courts. And by the 1990s, the composition of the Supreme Court had changed, and there was reason to think that there were probably 5 justices on the court at that time who were opposed to abortion rights and who would strike down Roe v. Wade or overturn Roe v. Wade. And so a major case made its way up to the US Supreme Court in 1992 called Planned Parenthood v. Casey. And again, this sort of movement to get this case up there and to get the Supreme Court that we had at that time was many, many years in the making. But what happened in the case involved a law out of Pennsylvania that contained a number of abortion restrictions. There was a waiting period requirement, a certain counseling requirement. There was a spousal notice requirement. There was a parental notice requirement, various other restrictions on abortion. And instead of overturning Roe v. Wade, what happened when the case got up to the Supreme Court is that a plurality of justices decided, but basically what happened was the Supreme Court decided to keep Roe in place and preserve what they considered the sort of essence of Roe v. Wade, that you could not ban abortion outright, at least before the fetus was viable, right? So before the point at which the fetus would be capable of surviving outside of the womb. So that's right now it's around 24 weeks of pregnancy. So you cannot ban abortion. But then the Supreme Court also changed the rule a little bit and said, but you can impose restrictions on abortion rights or on abortion if you don't impose what it called an undue burden on the abortion right, on the patient's right to make this decision for herself and in making access impossible. As long as you don't do that, as long as you don't prevent the individual from making the decision for herself, you can impose all kinds of restrictions on abortion. And that decision in 1992 just sort of opened the door to states really trying more and more onerous restrictions and pushing the envelope to see how far they could go without getting state laws struck down as violating abortion rights and imposing an undue burden on abortion rights. And you may be sitting there thinking right now, what do you mean undue burden? What is an undue burden on abortion rights? Well, part of the problem is nobody knew, right? It was kind of in the eye of the beholder. And so the courts, there were a lot of courts going different ways, a lot of confusion about what this ruling exactly meant. And again, this just created an opportunity for those who wanted to push abortion restrictions to go ahead and try to pass more and more burdensome laws. And we saw things like, all kinds of restrictions, but an example would be laws outlawing a particular kind of abortion procedure that is used maybe after a certain point in pregnancy, but still early enough to be sort of before that viability line. So they would just say, well, you can't use this procedure, but this procedure might be the safest option, or for some patients, the only option, right? So things like that. So increasingly this, and another restriction that we saw a lot during this time was restrictions on the clinics themselves and sort of what sorts of requirements they had to meet. Their doctors had to have admitting privileges at a hospital. The clinics had to have certain physical plant requirements. You had to, have certain capacity, certain parking, certain width of doorways, things like that. So all of these things happening across the country in various states, including in Ohio. But then what has happened even more recently, and there's really been a change since, I guess there have been two sort of key points. One was around 2010, 2011, where we started to really in Ohio see a huge increase in abortion restrictions being passed by our state legislature. And I think that had a lot to do with, we saw that across the country too. And I think it had a lot to do with a couple of political factors, one being the sort of Tea Party wing of the Republican Party really taking over and coming to dominate that party, and having that this being one of their focuses was abortion. And then also there was a redistricting, of course, across the country in 2010, and a lot of state legislatures in Republican dominated states became even more red, even more Republican. And the sort of, again, the deep red wing of the Republican Party that, again, for whom it was a real focus on banning or heavily restricting abortion. So, is that a question, or should I just keep talking for now? I just saw a hand go up. Okay, I'll keep talking for right now. You can interrupt me if I need to stop. So that happened, and then that corresponded with a real increase in abortion restrictions. And then the other thing that happened, of course, in 2016 was the election of President Donald Trump, and over that Trump's term, this further shift in the U.S. Supreme Court, which had already become, I wouldn't say completely hostile to abortion rights, but really a fairly unreliable protector of abortion rights. And then with Donald Trump getting 3 appointees to the U.S. Supreme Court, he was able to really shift the balance with respect to abortion rights. And the really key move, and I'm sure you all recall because it was fairly recent, was when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away and was replaced with now Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who is just sort of a polar opposite on many fronts, but particularly on abortion rights and reproductive rights. And so we already had, even before that, a 5-4 majority that appeared to be hostile to Roe v. Wade and abortion rights, but there was a lot of thinking that maybe Chief Justice Roberts, who is kind of a person who cares a lot about the political legitimacy of the Supreme Court and who is really sort of an institutionalist and has some moderate tendencies-ish. I mean, I have my own opinions about that, but that he might kind of preserve Roe. But once there was a 6-3 majority, that he might use his influence to try to preserve Roe. But now there's this 6-3 majority that looks ready to just overturn Roe v. Wade entirely and probably say that there is no constitutional right to choose abortion at all anymore. And so that fact has changed, I think, has emboldened anti-abortion forces in states even more. And so we started to see, even before this change, because everyone kind of saw it coming, we started to see laws being passed that would ban abortion altogether. And Ohio passed in 2019, oh my gosh, 2018 or 2019, passed a law banning abortion as soon as the heartbeat is audible, which is, it's not really a heartbeat, but this occurs around 5 to 6 weeks of pregnancy generally. So banning abortion at 6 weeks of pregnancy, which is before many people even know that they're pregnant. So this sort of law, and other states passed these sorts of laws too, and they got held up in court immediately. So Ohio's law, we actually went to the court. Preterm was the named plaintiff in that case, the lead plaintiff, and we got the law blocked. And it's never gone into effect in Ohio. And that is true in every state where it was passed. But nonetheless, what the strategy was that's okay. We know it's going to get struck down because we know laws like that are currently unconstitutional. under existing law, under Roe v. Wade. But what the state legislatures were thinking is, we're going to get this case up to the US Supreme Court, and then the US Supreme Court, which is the only body that can overturn Roe v. Wade, right, is going to reconsider Roe v. Wade and overturn it. So, and that's a process that takes a couple years. So that has been already building, already in the works, anticipating that they would have a friendly Supreme Court. And so those cases are currently making their way up through the courts. And one of those cases, and this is kind of, I think this is probably the point I'm just going to end on with my remarks, is just to say where things stand right now. There is a case out of Mississippi banning abortion starting at 15 weeks of pregnancy. So well before the viability point, which is around 24 weeks, clearly unconstitutional, just sort of unquestionably unconstitutional under the existing law that Mississippi passed this law anyway. A trial judge struck it down. It went up to the appeals court, which is called the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, is the federal appeals court in that part of the country. Extremely conservative court, also struck the law down because it's very clearly unconstitutional. And then Mississippi is now trying to appeal it up to the US Supreme Court. And the US Supreme Court doesn't have to take any particular case. It can decide what cases it does and doesn't want to hear. And what happens is the parties file these briefs in the Supreme Court saying, take this case. And then the other side says, don't take this case, leave the lower court decision in place. And then the Supreme Court meets every so often and has this big stack of briefs and goes through and decides which ones it's going to take and which ones it's not going to take. And a lot of times it'll have a big stack and it'll say, we're going to hold off on deciding about this one. Maybe we'll take it, maybe we won't. We'll put it off till next week. And they meet about once a week during the term. And this particular case has been in that stack, and the Supreme Court has had it in that stack of cases and keeps deciding not to decide whether to take it, deciding not to decide whether to decide it. It's been about a dozen times now. It has been
like
sitting in front of
15 times or something.
Yeah, crazy. It's been since almost a year that it's been sitting in a stack of cases, and the Supreme Court keeps kind of punting on it. And so we don't know whether the Supreme Court is going to take that case. If it takes it, if it decides, say, well, we could find out as soon as Monday that they've made a decision whether to take it, because they had another conference on Friday, or they could keep punting. But if they take it now, anytime between now and the end of the term, it's too late for the court to decide that case in 2021, basically, or basically in 2021. So it probably wouldn't get decided until 2022. But nonetheless, if the court takes it, it's probably a sign that the court is ready to radically reconsider abortion rights in general and maybe overturn Roe. And what that looks like is that probably what the court would say in some form is that Roe v. Wade was incorrect. There is no constitutional right to choose to have an abortion. And instead, it should be up to every individual state. So here's where the states' rights thing comes back, because really that on some level, that's what this is all about, that at least on the legal level, that states get to decide for themselves whether to allow abortion and up to what stage of pregnancy and under what circumstances and so on. And so we would end up with a total patchwork across the country of different state laws regulating abortion to different degrees. And Ohio would probably be a state that would ban abortion altogether based on what we've seen out of our legislature so far. And of course, I guess this might be a lead into what some of what Catrina is going to talk about. Of course, that would also mean that states are that like wealthy people who have access to resources, who can travel, who know people, are always going to be able to find a way to get the medical care they need, and that people who don't have those advantages are not. I mean, that's, and I think, Catrina can talk more about. It's probably to a large extent where we are now anyway, but it will get much, much worse. So I'll stop talking and turn it over to you.
So, so what Jessie said basically where we have this patchwork of laws across the country, and things are different in every state. That is actually already how it is in the country. This would just be like a more extreme version of that. So what we already have now across the United States is varying laws, state to state, that each abortion clinic has to comply with. The largest provider of abortions across the country are actually independent clinics like Preterm. And so when I say independent clinics, I mean clinics that are not Planned Parenthood clinics or that are not, hospital provided abortion care. So independent clinics like Preterm that are often small, don't have a ton of national resources or national pull in the same way that a Planned Parenthood or a big hospital system does, are doing the majority of the care across the country, and are also doing the majority of the litigation on these laws across the country. And so we're really lucky at Preterm. Jessie is our litigator, and also our board president. And so she and I get to work together really closely on how we move forward in the laws, and when we decide to take a case, and then how we decide to talk about that case with the multiple audiences that we serve. And so, we're a beacon of healthcare in our community. We also have a wide patient population that happens all over the state. Preterm is one of 2 abortion clinics in the state that go to the legal limit in Ohio, which is 21 weeks and 6 days here in the state. And then, so we see patients from all over the state and often from surrounding states. And so what Jessie said about people, having to travel for their care and that being like a position where really that's resourced people, that is already true. When we talk about abortion access in this country, abortion is already inaccessible for most of the people that need it. There's a law here in Ohio, and it is also a federal law that prohibits people in different ways from using their public insurance from being able to have access to abortion care via that public insurance. And what that means in praxis is that people are paying out of pocket for their abortion care, and abortion care by its very nature is something that you don't have an emergency fund for. Often what we're seeing in our patients is that they are having economic struggles, which means that they cannot have a baby at this time. They can't expand their family at this time because of the economic struggles that they're and so Preterm has what's called an abortion fund. We're one of the very few clinics in the country that has our own internal abortion fund that we use to help patients subsidize the access to their care, so no one is ever turned away because of their inability to pay for their abortion. And Jessie said that there's been a lot of laws passed here in Ohio. I think we're on 24. Does that sound right, Jessie?
That's about right. Yeah.
It's like 22 or 24 laws in Ohio that have been passed that, restrict access to abortion care in different ways. And between Jessie and I'm sure we could rattle off all of them for you. But I think what we really see is that the totality of these laws create a huge amount of hurdles for the most vulnerable people in accessing the care that they need at the time that they need it. And because of the structure of the way things have been set up legally and political pressures, a lot of abortion care has been really divorced from people's primary care, from their in-hospital care that they're receiving. And so there's kind of this divide that really feeds into abortion stigma that creates ways that people feel like they can't access abortion care, or that accessing abortion care is somehow an illegitimate form of healthcare. I got a lot of questions about whether our doctors are real doctors, whether our nurses are real nurses, whether our healthcare is trained, whether I actually went to law school. There's a lot of feelings that the people who work in abortion clinics are somehow illegitimate healthcare providers in some way, or that, our doctors are just skating by. They're the people that didn't do so well in medical school. And I can tell you that is fervently untrue. Our doctors are really extremely talented people who are extremely well trained in ways that I will never be able to comprehend. And yeah, one thing Jessie and I talk a lot about is like, okay, what does that weird healthcare thing that you said, doctor, mean to us? you know, they're extremely talented people who are really serving their community through, you know, comprehensive access to reproductive health care for their communities. And so this play, where what we're really seeing is that the right to life movement, the anti-choice movement, whatever you want to call it, is saying that, oh, well, we're here to protect these vulnerable people that need access to abortion care by passing all these laws. You know, abortion clinics are illegitimate, they're taking advantage of people, and these laws are a protection for those people. But what they're really doing is disenfranchising people from their access to healthcare. What they're doing is creating these multiple hurdles and then really feeding into abortion stigma, so people also feel shame when they're getting abortion care. And then because of those things, what we see is that people are unwilling or afraid to speak out about the care that they received and to take further part in movement actions to be able to roll these things back because of the depth of stigma and the real danger that there is out there from anti-abortion movement folks. And so, you know, I think one thing that I saw across the movement after the storming on the Capitol is that a lot of abortion clinic employees from all over the country were able to identify people that had stormed the Capitol as previous protesters at our clinics. So, you know, there's a lot of overlap there, and something that we all talk about in a variety of ways.
Inside that world, you know.
Yeah, once you're inside that kind of extremist world where you're being targeted by people who think it's appropriate to you know, harass people outside an abortion clinic, or to bring weapons, or, you know, all kinds of different things to the abortion clinic setting. Like, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from being able to do that in other ways. And they're extremely well funded and they're extremely well coordinated, which we see just about every Saturday. So, you know, the totality of these laws really creates a lot of hurdles for the patients that we serve: financial, emotional, and what we really see, and I think someone asked me about COVID before the thing started and the effects of COVID. And so, you know, Jessie and I had kind of had a plan of some of the things that we wanted to accomplish in 2020, particularly on the back of the 6-week abortion ban and on protester safety and all those kinds of things that we had talked about doing together. And Jessie, the 6-week abortion ban was right before July 4th. 2019. It feels like a million years ago.
No, you're right. Right. Yes.
And so, you know, then on March 10th, all those plans sort of went out the window. And then we got hit with a cease and desist shortly afterward, where they tried to shut down all the abortion clinics across the state and said that abortion clinics weren't providing essential, timely health care. And anyone who has been pregnant or knows somebody who's been pregnant knows that pregnancy is a progressing thing. That's sort of the nature of it. And so Jessie was able to go to court on behalf of Preterm and the other clinics in the state, and we got that law. Basically, the state didn't want to provide clarity around what they meant about how we were supposed to comply with the law. And so it's been quiet on that front. We don't expect any other COVID-related attacks on abortion access through the state, hopefully ever again. But yeah, so, you know, it's just been a series of hurdles from the 6-week ban, then COVID hitting. We're also currently in litigation around a lot of abortion clinics in the state are currently in litigation around a D&E ban, which Jessie talked about. That's a procedure that's done for people who are accessing abortion, usually after 14 to 15 weeks in abortion care. It kind of depends on each individual person. And it's just the way that abortions are done at that point in pregnancy. It's the medically sound way to deliver healthcare at that point. And so we've seen a law passed here in the state that would make that illegal or inaccessible for most of the people who needed access to that. We're also litigating a Down syndrome ban that would prevent people who've received a diagnosis of Down syndrome from accessing abortion care. We're trying to get some clarity on what they mean by those things. A lot of what we see here in Ohio is that the laws are written in such a way as to either be extremely difficult to comply with, or there's a lot of gray space around what the words mean. And so compliance is extremely difficult to come by. And the Ohio Department of Health is sort of busy because of the pandemic and the infighting that we're seeing at the state level around the Department of Health being able to enact healthcare provisions around the pandemic. And so they are unable or don't have the manpower or unwilling to give us clarity around how to comply with the laws that are passed through the legislature. So that's when we have to strategize around whether or not we're going to bring a lawsuit. And you know, those things are extremely confusing for the patients that we serve. We get calls every single day asking whether abortion is legal, whether people can come to us, whether we're open, if we'll give them an abortion, even though they think abortion is illegal, and having to really work around those things and offer clarity without having to get into the weeds around the litigation that we're serving, because at the end of the day, people are coming to us for healthcare. They're coming, you know, we see people who say they're pro-life, we see people who are anti-abortion, we see protesters who need access to abortion care. And so what we really are there to do is to provide extremely high quality healthcare for the people that we serve on the day that they need it, without having to get into the political mire around the access to abortion. And so we're kind of walking this line all the time where we're wanting to increase access to abortion throughout the state, destigmatize abortion, and create a movement where, you know, passing laws like this is unacceptable to Ohioans. Polls show that around 70% of Ohioans believe that abortion should be legal and accessible in some way in the state of Ohio. But what we really see through gerrymandering, through a years-long movement to really conservatize the federal court, and for a long time, the state Supreme Court here in Ohio, we just recently had some wins on that front, is that these laws have been able to be passed, they've been able to be protected in a lot of ways, and that the clarity around how we're supposed to comply with the laws has gotten muddier and muddier over time. And the laws are definitely getting more extreme. I think for a long time, they really couched them as like safety provisions. And what we're seeing now is that they're just really attacks on access with no real safety provisions, even sort of built into them, and that they're truly just rooted in abortion stigma. So they've definitely gotten emboldened. And I think they're sort of running out of safety related provisions to pass in a lot of ways, because there's been, like we said, between 22 and 24 laws passed in like the past, so I graduated 2010. Yeah, so, you know, during my time working in this movement, so from around 2010 to now, we've seen between 22 and 24 laws passed. So it's been really an onslaught in a lot of ways. And I know it's a little after 10, and I know we want to leave a lot of time for Q&A. Jessie, does that sound good to you? Is there anything you think we should keep?
I was just going to jump on something you said, which is something that is a point you've made to me, like privately as well, which is that, you know, the idea of the unclarity in these laws and the confusing, how they're written confusingly. And you said, you know, these laws are not written to be complied with, which 100% true. They are not, they are written for, you know, to show their for the legislators to show their anti-abortion cred, right? To show, to stigmatize abortion, to scare people. And, but, you know, a lot of times I don't even think they care whether, you know, clinics find a way to comply or not. I mean, they have to shut down, but, you know, they don't care. They don't really care. And
they're written so they can whip up their base to get both votes and donations from people. Like, that's why they present these laws. It's not because they think they can be complied with, or they're written with some sort of understanding of either healthcare or the way these things operate. Like, they're just truly written so they can get that stamp on their ad that says endorsed by Ohio Right to Life, and then get all the money that comes with that.
Yeah. And there was that study that was just published.
I was talking about this before you jumped on the call.
Oh, really? Yeah. Yeah. So that in Ohio, 10%, it was a study specifically of Ohio women of reproductive age. And it showed that 10% of women in Ohio of reproductive age thought abortion was illegal in Ohio. And another about 26% or 27% weren't sure. And so fully over a third, when you add those numbers together, of women in Ohio either didn't know or thought abortion was illegal. And these numbers had gone up after that 6-week ban, the so-called heartbeat bill was passed in Ohio too. And our numbers in response to those questions are also higher than in neighboring states. So that's another impact that I think is completely intended of this kind of lawmaking.
Yeah, and we anticipated that impact. You know, the phone started ringing sort of as soon as the bill got introduced, asking whether abortion is still legal in the state. And the legislative process in Ohio is extremely confusing. It's not meant to be clear for voters. It's not meant to be clear for constituents. We have a really unique system here in Ohio where we have a consistent 2-year session. So they can introduce and pass bills at any time during the 2-year session. And then once the bill is passed, there's a wait period before the bill actually goes into effect. And that's somewhat unusual at the state level. And so during that waiting period before the bill goes into effect, there's a lot of confusion about whether or not it's in effect, whether it's not in effect. And the majority of preterm staff are healthcare providers. They are not policy wonks. They're not attorneys. You know, I'm a team of 2 now that follows and tracks these laws. And so, you know, there's 2 of us that are deeply mired in the policy world, and then the rest of our 60-person staff is just providing healthcare on a daily basis to our patients. And so having to answer and navigate these highly political, highly technical policy questions is, you know, not something that a nurse would normally do in their life and in their role as a healthcare provider. And so we launched a website that I put in the chat called Abortion is Legal in Ohio. And we've done that with our partners throughout the state to provide clarity around, you know, all these bills that we're facing, to, you know, start to talk about, like, these are the things that we're seeing. This is the clear answer about it. And abortion is still legal, not just here in Ohio, but in all 50 states. Abortion is legal, and there is a clinic operating in every single state in the United States. And so some of those states just have 1 clinic. West Virginia just has 1, South Dakota. But, you know, here in Ohio, we have clinics strewn about the state that are providing healthcare, providing abortion care in a variety of ways. And so we really wanted to make that clear to people, to connect them with the clinic that is closest to them, and to get them the funding and the practical support that they need to get their abortion, whether that's transportation, money, a gas card, you know, a gift card for lunch. You know, we have a 24-hour waiting period here in Ohio that requires every person come to the clinic twice. 70% of our patients are already parents. And so what that means is people have children, they have jobs, they need to find childcare, they need to take time off work. A lot of people don't feel comfortable telling their boss, like, I need 2 days off work so I can go get my abortion. And so what does it mean to be able to navigate all those hurdles, walk past the protesters, and come into preterm? So we're here to sort of provide a wraparound service that gets all those check marks down the to-do list, and also gets you your abortion and has you feeling safe and well when that's all over.
But both of you have raised some very interesting topics, but our guest would like to ask you some questions. So this is for administrative purposes only. When people are asking questions, please go to the bottom of your screen under Q&A and enter your question. The chat area, I've noticed there are some questions put on chat, but please go to the Q&A. And our questions, you can type these in. I've tried different for myself. You might type it offline, like on a Word document. You can copy and paste it if you want, but please submit the questions and our guest will answer. Now, the Q&A session will end about 10:40 because we have some administrative matters. So please.
So thank you so much, both of you, for a really good overview about this topic and for also updating our information. It's very, very timely right now. I'll start with a question from one of our attendees. So this person asked, if abortion is banned in Ohio, how do you think this will affect contraceptive options in Ohio, birth control, basically? And so this person says, I don't believe that IUDs, rings, implants, and so on actually cause abortion, but a number of people do believe that. And I'll add to that question a little bit. Just in a general way, do you think that banning or restricting abortion also creates restrictions for birth control in general?
So I can talk about that.
Yeah.
Okay, from the legal perspective, at least, is right now, as the laws are written in Ohio, those forms of contraception would not constitute abortion, like they don't meet the legal definition. So, and that's not true everywhere, but the way our laws are written, it has to be like an existing pregnancy that you are intentionally terminating, basically, for something to be an abortion. And so even if some people sort of understand that as because it in some cases can have an impact on a fertilized egg, it doesn't meet the definition under Ohio law.
Okay.
Now, could that change? I mean, it would not surprise me if that was sort of the next frontier in Ohio after abortion. If abortion is banned, that this would be the next thing in the legislature's sights. I mean, they can always change that law and they can always change that definition, but as it is right now, it's not.
Yeah, and so I was going to say exactly what Jessie said, that those forms of birth control don't meet the legal or medical definition of what it means to have an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think even if they did adjust the laws, we could perhaps, I don't know, make some arguments about how they don't meet the medical definition of what it means to have an abortion. That is definitely something we would have to talk about as it came down the line. But also in praxis, what it means is that a lot of abortion care providers are also sexual health care providers, and people are coming to us for their, full range of options, including contraception. And so, most people are just going to their local preterm, their local Planned Parenthood, whatever it is, to get their birth control. And so if a law was passed that made abortion extremely inaccessible, or that shut down a vast majority of the clinics in the state, there would be a huge decrease in access to birth control throughout the state, just because of the number of patients that we're all seeing to get access to those things.
I'll ask one more question, and then Chris will ask the next question after that. So I was interested when you were talking about the what's going on in Mississippi. Is it 15 weeks? Am I correct about that? So I'm just wondering, how many women do not know they are pregnant? I'm not saying by 15 weeks, but let's say before that, in time to make plans and to make a decision.
Right. Do you want to talk about that, or?
So I was just going to talk about the way pregnancy is measured. So pregnancy is measured based on your last menstrual period. So if you miss your period, and then it takes about 4 weeks, till your next period would come. And that's when you would go, oh, wait, this doesn't seem right. So it's pretty rare for us to see patients, honestly, before 6 weeks of pregnancy. So, that what we're really talking about is the time between 6.5 weeks and 15 weeks. And that's the majority of patients that we see are coming in during that time period for their abortion care services. So, with all the hurdles there are, and Mississippi has even more hurdles than Ohio does when it comes, they might even have a 72-hour waiting period in Mississippi. Do you know, Jessie?
They have a long waiting period.
Yeah, they have a long waiting period. We have 24 hours. They're either 48 or 72. And so, what you're really seeing is an increase in the hurdles that people have to do at the primary time when people are, learning that they are pregnant, coming to the decision about what they want to do, gathering the resources to be able to effectively access that decision, and then finding their way to the clinic in the state. And I believe Mississippi has like 2 or 3 abortion clinics in the state. There's not very many. And so people are traveling long distances. So that 15-week ban, if you're thinking about between 6, 7 weeks and 15 weeks, that's honestly a pretty short period of time for people to be navigating all those hurdles. I would garner any bet that that's the majority of patients that they're seeing in the state.
And we also know that there are groups of patients that are likely to figure out that they're pregnant much later than the
Mhm.
like if you're very young and maybe you don't have regular periods or whatever, like younger people tend to figure it out later. Also, you know, people who are in like, difficult situations, you know, maybe people who are homeless, people who are, you know, in
Abusive relationships. Yeah.
yes. So it's not always even, you know, that early. But yeah, but by the time you at the moment that, like, just picking up on what Catrina said about how we date pregnancies, at the moment that the egg gets fertilized by the sperm, you are actually already 2 weeks pregnant because they
Correct.
from your last. So it's really very, it's an even shorter.
Yeah. And so then sometimes in certain states, particularly really conservative states that have a huge anti-abortion movement in the state, they will date pregnancy based on conception in the law, but we date it based on last menstrual period just because that is the medical norm. And so the laws and the medicine don't line up, and that is a bear to navigate as well.
All right, I have a question here from Eileen, and she writes that she is a social historian and has a minor in physical geography. And that's the basis for her question, which is as follows. Given that we are going through the planet's most important revolution of a population explosion, and given that every crisis that we are now experiencing is due to this revolution of a population explosion, and given that choice is probably the only solution in this problem and crisis, why have we not heard anything about the fact that this revolution is the reason that we need choice?
Wow. That's I don't know. Do you want to take, or I can take a shot at
I
that?
can start. I can start. I think, you know, what we really see is, for me, pregnancy, building your family, access to abortion, access to being able to build the family that you want is a highly personal decision. And I don't think that by grounding it in a rhetoric around population control is effective. And honestly, it's pretty flawed. Like, when we talk about population control, automatically people think about some worst case scenario things that have happened. I think, you know, the practice of eugenics and other population control measures can come into play there in really negative ways. We're often serving the most vulnerable populations who need access to abortion care, and, you know, who haven't historically had access to comprehensive reproductive health care, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ folks, people who have been really left out of the comprehensive access to reproductive health care overall, and whose bodies have been marginalized. And so when we ground it in a framework around population control, I think the bridge to being able to really ground that in rhetoric that is often like rooted in historically racist practices or practices around controlling people with disabilities, people who are LGBTQ identified, like that's a short bridge. And so I think that when we do that, we really have to ground it in the personal.
Yeah, I think that I agree. I think that, you know, much as there's, you know, plenty of probably I mean, I don't know a lot about this area, but I'm assuming a lot of you know, accuracy, scientific accuracy to that. The idea is, right, like we're already, like we the folks who are supporting abortion rights are already being painted as like eugenicists, and I think they're concerned that that's like that's going to happen. And just an example, Catrina alluded to it earlier, but Ohio passed a law banning abortion for if it's because you've got a fetal diagnosis of Down syndrome, so you cannot abort a fetus because of Down syndrome, and that's the only reason that's singled out. But in the law, but you know, challenging that law has been very challenging because. And it's not in effect right now, just to make sure that information's out there. But because, you know, the state and lots of people, their first reaction is like, "Ooh, that's eugenics. You shouldn't be having abortions for that reason," right? And like, and our point is, no, it's, you know, eugenics is trying to control individuals' reproductive choices for particular social ends. What we are trying to do is just, you know, give like people the autonomy to make their own decisions. We're not telling them they should or shouldn't have abortions in this situation. We are wanting to, you know, make it possible for them to decide for themselves instead of dictating that decision. But, you know, It's very right. It's very nuanced, and it can get lost in the sort of politics and the big headlines around what's going on.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Eileen has a follow-up question where she says that the situation sounds like death by 1,000 cuts, meaning all the restrictions and barriers that are put in place, despite no outright prohibition. And she wants to know, is it a death by 1,000 cuts?
Yep.
Yeah.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I mean, that's how I'll often like talk about it when I'm on panels and stuff like that too. I've heard Kelly Copeland, who's the executive director at NARAL, use that phrase also. You know, it really is just like, they, because of the existing, you know, Supreme Court framework, they can't close it down entirely. So they'll just like pick and pick and pick and pick and pick and pick and pick.
Yeah. And even like stuff that flies under the radar, you know, there was an abortion case this past summer, if you were paying, you know, if you follow these things, where the Supreme Court, you know, struck down a law out of Louisiana that would have closed many of Louisiana's abortion clinics. And it was seen as this big victory. But at the same time, the Supreme Court like snuck this language, or Chief Justice Roberts in particular, snuck this language into the opinion that has really like made it harder for us to challenge restrictions in the future. And so it's all this sort of a lot of it even flies under the radar. I mean, another thing that I think is a part of this death by 1,000 cuts is but people don't talk about a lot, is like the financing, like the ban Catrina mentioned on using, you know, public insurance, Medicaid, for example, for abortion. And then, you know, there are states that ban private insurance for abortion, and just it has made the financial climate very difficult for a lot of clinics to survive in. And so that's another sort of aspect of it.
Debbie brings up an interesting topic. She says, if there's no Roe versus Wade, then in the current legal environment, the newer anti-abortion laws, the physician or providers can be charged with murder, while the woman's not accused of murder. Does this mean that other people could be affected? Let's say someone who transports a woman to another place for an abortion, or in other situations, can other clynicians be charged legally?
You were actually just talking about this really recently.
Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead, Jessie, and talk about the accessory provisions?
Yeah. So they're right. So one thing is, I mean, it could be considered murder, although states could just create a separate crime of abortion, but it would probably carry pretty serious penalties. It wouldn't necessarily be murder, although Ohio there's a bill proposed like every so often that would make abortion basically equivalent to murder. But so that being said, but could other people be charged? I mean, yeah, probably. So the question, it's kind of a question of like, what are states going to really do? Will they pass laws making it a crime to take someone out of state or to travel out of state to have an abortion? Will they prosecute abortions that actually happen in other states, or people for facilitating those abortions? Like, it's more of a political question in a lot of ways. I mean, legally, it's kind of a gray area, but it seems like states most likely would have a lot of authority to criminalize things, at least things that happen in the state that would lead to an abortion out of state. So paying for someone's abortion, driving them over state lines, things like that.
And I think in a lot of cases, it would be up to the individual prosecutor in each of the probably counties where those things are occurring about how they wanted to enforce those laws. And, here in Ohio, we elect our prosecutors. And so I imagine a lot of those positions would be very politically motivated.
Jonathan also has a question related to legality. He says, if the Supreme Court hears the law outlawing abortion in Mississippi after 15 weeks and upholds it, does that in fact overturn Roe v. Wade, or simply restrict abortion to under 15 weeks?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it really depends on what the court, that's a great question. It really depends on what the court says when it does that. So it could go either way. It could be just like, okay, we buy the state's rationales that like something happens at 15 weeks. I think they said I actually think they might have said in that case that it had to do with fetal pain,
I
which
think so too.
yeah, which is also scientifically inaccurate. Like as far as the best evidence indicates, there isn't, that's not the case at 15 weeks that fetuses can feel pain. But the state claimed that was the case. So I think, they could just say, well, we agree that happens at 15 weeks. 15 weeks is the new limit. Or they could say, we're using this as an opportunity to reconsider the whole framework. And it could go either way, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I think in a lot of ways, the Supreme Court is like one of our more mysterious government bodies, but because they have a lot of latitude, they could decide the case just based on this one law and apply it only to that state or only to the clinics in that state, or they could throw the doors wide open and, apply it to the whole country, apply it to all the abortion cases that we've seen beforehand. They really get to decide what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know
All right,
until it comes out.
Okay, we have another question here from David. He asks, legally, what is the difference between cremation and incineration? What is the current status of Ohio law about requiring cremation? And if they truly made this law to respect the humanity of the fetus, then why exclude miscarriage? Is that fetus, the miscarried one, less valuable than an aborted one?
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you take that one, Jessie.
Yes, lots of questions. Somebody is up on what's been going on in Ohio law.
Yeah.
So some of you that may know that the Ohio General Assembly just passed during the lame duck session in December this past year, a law that requires that tissue from an abortion be either cremated or buried as if it were essentially, a human body, right? And treated in that way. And so that law is not yet gone into effect. So that's the status. First of all, it has an effective date of April 6th. It's possible there will be litigation trying to get that postponed or held up until the law can be determined whether it's constitutional or not. But in the meantime, the question about the cremation versus incineration, I mean, the interesting thing is medically and scientifically, there's no difference between the processes. They are identical processes. The only difference is that cremation has to occur, again, sort of the legal difference, like you said, is that cremation has to occur like at a licensed crematory. And so that complies with certain requirements under a different part of the code, whereas incineration has to do with medical waste, and it's processed at a different kind of facility. And so including like some hospitals have their own incineration facilities and things like that. So it's really that's the only difference. But a cremation, because of one feature of the law is that it like, for example, may require because of the nature of the process of cremation, how it's legally regulated, each individual fetus or embryo has to be cremated separately. So that is something that it would drive up, and we partly don't know because the state hasn't given us really guidance on this, but would drive up the cost tremendously. So cremation becomes a much more expensive option than incineration. Did I answer? Was there other questions in there?
I think the second question was like a morality question around miscarriages versus abortions. I mean, the short answer to that is abortion stigma. They're passing this law because of abortion stigma, because they want people to feel bad about their abortions. And, because they don't believe this law can be complied with. It was not written or passed in a way to be complied with. It was passed to close down abortion clinics. That's it. That's the only reason. And so they know that it's expensive. They intentionally wrote in a lot of gray area that we were talking about, Jessie and I talk about all the time. And it's been a huge topic of conversation around here recently. Mm-hmm. And so, this law was written to close abortion clinics and to make people feel bad about their abortions. That's it. That's the only reason. They're not making it may seem like they're making some morality argument, or like they're trying to, provide people with some sort of dignity or whatever. We work with each of our patients individually to make sure that their wishes, their desires around what happens with their fetus after their abortion, that happens for them. If our patients want burial, if they want cremation, if they want incineration, whatever they want, we work with them to make sure that those needs and wishes are being met so they have the closure they need to move forward in their lives. This law doesn't, it doesn't take into account each individual woman or pregnant person's desires. It really mandates religious ceremonies for people in a way that isn't compatible with a lot of people's religious views. I've heard a lot of people from the National Council of Jewish Women talk out against this law because it is directly in conflict with a lot of Jewish beliefs, and so I think that this law was really passed to provide additional hurdles for abortion clinics to operate in a lot of ways that don't have clarity and to make people feel ashamed.
Yeah. Yeah. And just another thing on the miscarriage point, when this law was being considered, there were folks, it made me crazy because there were folks from the Ohio Right to Life who got up and said, we're just asking for abortions to be treated the same as miscarriages because Ohio law already does this with miscarriages. And that's absolutely not true.
Not
so
true.
Ohio law does require doctors and clinics to tell patients that, they have an option if they want to seek burial or cremation, but they don't have to. And if they choose not to, then the regular, incineration process applies. So but this new law mandates you have to choose burial or cremation. So it's true that now miscarriage patients have a choice, but this is taking away that choice from patients who have an abortion because it mandates one or the other. So anyway, yeah, it's there's a lot of misconception about that.
Yeah.
All right, Chris writes in that the Republicans rely on this abortion issue to garner the votes of single issue voters. Do you think that this Republican Party would ever actually overturn Roe versus Wade?
Oh, because it would not suit them politically. Yeah. I mean, I think that's been the big calculus for a while. I think that's been the calculus at the Supreme Court too, is like,
I agree.
it's so much more advantageous to do this by 1,000 cuts, as one of the earlier questioners said, because we can keep this issue alive and, but make abortion not meaningfully available. So I think that's I don't know. I think it's possible they're going to overplay their hand. I mean, because some people really do want it overturned, right?
Yeah.
And,
yeah, I guess punting raises money, doesn't it? So I haven't thought about that really, but that's probably part of their political strategy, is the longer they punt, the longer they can keep raising money off of it. And I do agree with Jessie. I think at some point they're going to overplay. But I'm not in tune enough with the national Republican strategy to understand what they're. They wouldn't let me into their meetings, I don't think.
Yeah, but they may find they're like the dog that caught the car, right? Like that. Yeah.
This is really interesting. I'm learning so much today from the way you answer the questions. Just to follow up on that, that's kind of a disconnect to me. It's like, here you've got, what we hear is that the majority of the people in the United States are in favor of women having a choice. And then you hear that it's politically advantageous for the Republican Party or for certain individuals to try to get away, to do away with abortion and to do away with Roe versus Wade. So that, to me, those two don't connect. How does it help people? Is it all just about money? I keep hearing about money, and obviously the single issue voter, but in the long run, how does that actually help candidates, and how does it help a party?
So I think what we have to do is take the totality of what the Republicans have been able to do across the country with gerrymandering, with disenfranchising people's access to vote. I think Georgia is a perfect example of this, historically red state where people worked really hard, Black women in particular, to get the access to voting to populations that have not normally had that access. So when we say 70% of the population is perhaps in favor of people having access, that's not 70% of registered voters. And so registered voters and the American public are two different populations in a lot of ways because of the historic ability of conservatives to disenfranchise people from their right to vote. And so, you know, Republicans are invested in certain populations having access to vote in a way that they're not invested in other populations having access to vote. And so they're able to play their hand in this way right now because of who gets to the ballot box.
And I do think it's partly the intensity of single issue voters on the right. Like I think there are fewer single issue voters on the left around the right. It's partly because of, like, we suffer from the status quo still sort of mildly favoring us, or everybody knowing that Roe v. Wade is still there. Well, not everybody, I guess instead of Ohioans, but you know, certain the fact that like there's this perception that, well, Roe hasn't been overturned, so it's still okay. I can worry about other things. I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough question. I don't know. Yeah.
Renee asked, is it getting more difficult to get accredited doctors to work in clinics? And what about access to hospitals? Has it become more difficult to do that? I'll ask this one, and then we're just beginning to come to the end of this. So after you answer this one, I think Chris will ask the last question or two.
Sure. So there was a law passed in Ohio that requires us to have a written transfer agreement with the local hospital within 30 miles that it does not receive public funding. And so that law was specifically passed to close down clinics in more rural areas. That's why that I think Ken gave the like 15 to 9 number earlier around the number of clinics there used to be in the number of clinics now. A lot of that is due to the written transfer agreement. It was specifically targeted to close down clinics, and that was passed in 2015.
Oh, well, it's been, yeah, it's kind of been, it's
Something
older
like that.
than that, but it's, yeah.
So
Iterations.
yes, and you know, different clinics have variances and stuff like that. So that law was passed. Preterm has a written transfer agreement with University Hospital. That's the hospital that provides us with our transfer agreement. I think the climate in Ohio makes it difficult for doctors to want to work here, not just because of abortion care, but because of a lot of other things. And so I think, yeah, that it's not just about abortion. I think that the political climate around healthcare in Ohio in general, I think they have a tough time recruiting doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals to come here for all kinds of reasons.
Another whole topic.
Yeah, that's like a whole, and so then, you know, of course we have trouble getting people because healthcare professionals don't want to work in Ohio for a wide variety of reasons. And so that makes our pool smaller. But Preterm has a really wonderful reputation as a healthcare provider nationally and as abortion care provider nationally. And we actually just recently had a doctor move across the country to come work at Preterm specifically.
Yeah, I actually, and just as far as the role hospitals play, because I was working on something else, I just came across the statistic that in Ohio, I think in 2019, maybe 0.25% of abortions were performed in hospitals, not 25, but 0.25. The number was like 39 or something in the whole state in an entire year. So yeah. Hospitals are not a practical option for various reasons, mostly having to do with like insurance not covering abortion unless there's like a serious medical, severe medical indication. So basically it's almost all provided in clinics or other, non-hospital settings.
Yeah, and Preterm provides the vast majority of abortion care services in the state.
All right, Chris needs some help with his memory. He remembers seeing a film or documentary many years ago about the Republican pursuit of the abortion issue in order to target and encourage voters. And do you know about this film? And if so, what is the name of it? I
don't know. There are a lot of movies about abortion care, a lot of documentaries about abortion care.
Yeah,
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm so sorry. I wish I did.
Right. There's a book by Linda Greenhouse from the New York Times and Reva Siegel, who is a professor at Yale, where they compiled a bunch of like documentary evidence, like writings and so on around that era when the sort of the early 60s, when the strategy became to sort of use abortion as a wedge issue to like, and it really very clearly shows how this was an intentional strategy to take abortion and use it as an issue to get voters to come over to the Republican side, who would otherwise be Democratic voters. I think it's called something like Before Roe v. Wade, but anyway, no, I don't know of a film, but sounds interesting.
It does.
All right, well, now it's 10:40 and time to turn it back over. Ken?
Well, both of you, thanks. Hold on. Huh. Well, thank you both for speaking. And I just have a quick comment. Professor Hill, I noticed that you have someone looking over your shoulder on your bookcase, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it looks like. I just happened to notice that, so okay.
That's a good eye. You must have me big on your screen or something.
Yeah.
Well, I noticed her collar, but anyhow, thank you both for taking the time from your morning. I just want to say next Sunday on March 7th, we're going to have a topic called Politics and Polling and What Went Wrong. According to the polls, Biden's margin of victory was half of what had been predicted in 2020. Less than 6% of survey respondents answered phones due to robocalls, and I'm one of these. I don't answer robocalls. Anyways, internet polling samples based on income, race, age, education pose formidable challenges. Much of our democracy depends on being able to understand citizens' opinions, for example, on COVID-19, taxes, racial justice, climate change, immigration, and many other issues. So the question then is, should we even trust the polls coming into 2021? Our guest speaker will be Tom Sutton. He's a political science professor at Baldwin Wallace and director of the Community Research Institute. I look forward to his speaking. He's been here before with us, and I hope both of you will join us maybe in the future as well. For those who have an interest, we have the UUCC service at 11 o'clock. Because of COVID, you're going to have to log into uucleveland.org, and there will be a green box in the upper right corner of the screen. Please click on it, and as my understanding, it's pre-recorded, okay? So it's not going to be live, but click on video and the service will be posted. Reverend Cherry, who is the minister for our congregation, hopefully will give us a meditative means for us to face the challenges for our upcoming week. And I ask all of you to stay well for the upcoming future. Thank you again.
Thank you